Again, my name is Karen Rose. My day job, I work at the Internet Society as Senior Director for Strategy and Analysis, but I'm giving this presentation in my personal capacity based on some of the history that I have with the IANA function. I used to work for the US government early on in the day, in around 1996 to 1998 at the Federal Communications Commission, which is the U.S. government telecommunications regulator, and then at the Department of Commerce NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, that was eventually tasked with the job of trying to figure out what to do with the IANA and the domain name system going forward. The name of this short talk is the IANA Transition in Early History. Another subtitle might be the IANA transition, how the hell did we get here in the first place? And how did the US government get involved anyway? So I'm going to try and give you basically about 19 years of history in 15 minutes. So put your seatbelts on and here we go. So first I'd like to sort of give you some headlines. Internet governance not scaling well. DNS, IANA, and US on a collision course. Consensus fractured, multiple crises in internet governance, and chaos in the DNS infrastructure. I'd like you all to guess what year this is from. This year, last year, or a few years ago? Anybody? This kind of stuff sound familiar to any of you that have touching the governance space? Well, these headlines are actually from 1997, September 1997, in the Gordon-Cook report. So this was at the very early instances of some of this churn and change in the domain name system. So we can see from here that, you know, a lot of the storylines really haven't changed very much since the late 90s. So this whole IANA transition is a really difficult process, and some of the issues that we had back in 1997 still remain today as a challenge. So as Nurani mentioned, and as you all probably know, the IANA coordinates unique identifiers. We all know that the internet is a distributed system, but there are a few unique identifiers that need to be coordinated and maintained as unique in order for the global system to work. Of course, that's names, particularly at the root zone level. Top level domains, you really only want one.com or one.se. You want that to be unique. Numbers, including IP numbers and ASNs, and protocol parameters. So those are the three major areas of activity that the IANA, or the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, keeps and maintains. It's really more of a bookkeeping function than it is in itself a policy-making function. So the original IANA was John Pastel, one of the early pioneers of the Internet. He was named the Internet Numbers Czar back in the 1980s, and as a service to the community, took on the role of maintaining the administrative functions for these unique identifiers, names, numbers, and addresses. These functions, he first started doing these at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and then they moved with him when he went to the USC, University of Southern California Information Sciences Institute, so USC ISI. Any of you who know, and he was obviously a researcher in computing under university department. And as many of you know who are in the university space, universities, when they're doing grants with governments, they kind of like to throw in kind of everything extra that they're doing, you know, so it can get some funding. Pretty much was the same case with the IANA function. IANA was very much seen, and John's role was very much seen as a critical role that was provided to the community. And USC ISI put that role under a contract with the Defense Department Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. And that contract was called the Terranode contract, and I was looking for a copy of it. I couldn't find one, but it's about this thick. And kind of in the back near the footnotes is this the note that says we got to coordinate all these unique identifiers, and John Pastel will do that as part of this contract. So that indeed is how the IANA functions became part of a US government contract. You know, basically it was put into a university research contract that was paid for. And again, it was really a very tiny portion of what was quite a substantial technical research contract, but that's how it got in there. In addition to this contract, and under which John performed the IANA functions, there was also another key contract that came about in the 1990s with Network Solutions, and that was primarily for the registration of domain names. So you had one contract with USC-ISI for the IANA functions contract. You had what was called a cooperative agreement with Network Solutions to run what was then called portions of the Internet. Anybody remember the Internet? We're a couple of hands. Okay, an early networking coordination function when the Internet was really still, for the most part, kind of in the NREN phase. So Network Solutions would register these interesting things, domain names, and John would keep track of these at that higher level. Now, John was a real key member of the community, of course, but he was also a very well trusted guy, and he tended to administer the IANA in a pretty sort of factual bookkeeping way, and he participated with the community in policy making, but tended to keep a little bit of a separation between his administrative functions and his policy making views with the community. In 1996, we do have to remember that it was a bit of a different world. You know, for all of the headlines we had, when the Internet domain name system issue really started brewing in terms of what do we do with this, it was a real time of transition for the Internet. And this is really where the controversies over the DNS started. So really, in 1996, commercial traffic was a new reality. Commercial traffic was first led on the NSFnet through an act of Congress in the United States in 1992. You know, in some cases around the world, including in places like Sweden, you had to sign up to NSFnet acceptable use policy when it came to certain kinds of traffic flows going over the network. And in 1992, that changed to actually allow commercial traffic on that on the NSFnet backbone. So the network was also transitioning from a research network to commercial. So in 1995, this was only a year before 1996 when these things started to blow up, the NSFnet in the United States was decommissioned, right? So the research role of the US government and other agencies was starting to pull back, and commercial traffic was starting to emerge as one of the dominant forms of traffic over the network. So this was really new. 4 years for commercial traffic on the NSFnet, only 1 year after the NSFnet was decommissioned. There weren't too many internet users on the internet in 1996. About 36 million, and about 66% of those were in the United States. We're talking about a pretty small base of users. Nonetheless, it was growing rapidly. There were not that many internet hosts. There were about 10 million, but they were growing rapidly in part because of commercialization. So the 10 million internet hosts that there were in 1996, depending on the month that they take the number, that was up 100% from 1995. So you're seeing this tremendous growth in part pushed by commercial traffic. The World Wide Web was also driving exponential growth in terms of domain names. And this is where we start seeing and start getting the real rub about how do we manage domain names in these IANA functions. So in 1996, again, depending on the month that you take the number, there were about 500,000 domain name registrations, primarily in .com, .net, and .org, which were managed as monopoly by Network Solutions, and they were charging $70 a year for those registrations. The way you could get a registration, by the way, through Network Solutions is by sending an email or a fax. So sort of no online registration possibilities. But that number, 500,000, was doubling every 6 months, in part because of the growth of the internet, and in part because people were starting to say, hey, I can make money on this, including by holding for ransom trademarks of large trademark holders. So we're seeing this big rise. So small word, but a big time of transition from the research origins to the more commercial network we see today. So in 1996 to 1997, we really were set up with a situation of a perfect storm when it came to especially the DNS, protocol parameters, not much money to be, not money to be made there, pretty well handled. There were some controversies coming up in the numbering space. I think at this time there were only 2 RIRs. There was only RIPE and APNIC. AARON wasn't even in existence, I think, until the end of 1997, early 1998. So there were a little bit of controversy coming up through the numbering space. But 96 to 97 was a real perfect storm in terms of concerns over the IANA functions. So first of all, there were these growing legal conflicts over trademarks and domain names. This is when we first see, sort of legitimate conflicts between, people registering what they maybe thought were generic names and a trademark holder saying that they had a right in it, but also domain name speculation, especially with trademarks. So this was a real growing legal front. Trademark owners were not terribly happy that they had to take all of these people to court all the time to protect what they saw as their trademark in domain names. Of course, on the flip side, there was also a human rights and a speech argument, right? Who are these trademark owners to think that they have unique ownership of these names? So there's a big conflict brewing. Second of all, there were growing conflict in terms of CCTLD delegations and growing interest by associated governments. John Pastel's policy for delegating CCTLDs, which was pretty much fine in the academic researching days, was, he gave them out to his friends who he knew in the academic and research context all over the world, which was fine for, places that were on the internet and had internet research networks. But then you get these kind of small states that weren't on the internet, including many in Africa, including many in the Pacifics, and John would give them out to people he thought could be caretakers for the domains. One interesting early conflict, now you see the tumultuous seas there. It's not quite a pirate story, but it's close. Oops. Was the issue of Pitcairn Island. Does anybody know where Pitcairn Island is? Yay! Some people know. So it's a little island in the South Pacific. It consists of about 40 people who are descendants, literally, from the bounty mutineers and their Tahitian wives, and they sought refuge on Pitcairn Island. And they kind of got interested in this domain thing because, like, Tuvalu and other islands were looking like, maybe they were making some money off of it. Only to find out that the delegation for Pitcairn Island had been given to a computer scientist that was in the Channel Islands between the UK and France. So this was one issue where, these people on this island were saying, hey, why don't we have this delegation? They went to the UK government and said, well, one guy on our island, I guess, did some deal with this guy in the UK, but, we'd really like to get it back, please. And at that time, there was no real process to handle that sort of redelegation in which there was a significant conflict. So this is really when government started to get involved in particular, especially over CCTLDs, but not exclusively. Another big issue was this lawsuit, was called the PG Media lawsuit. Basically, it was an organization that was suing to get their TLD in the root zone, right? There was no clear process for how would you want to add a new GTLD in the root zone if you wanted to. Well, this one company started suing Information Sciences Institute, so where John Pastel works, because everybody heard, I guess you go to John if you want a new TLD. They were suing Network Solutions because they also had a role in publishing the root zone through the A-root server. And then, of course, the US government was beginning to get involved because the US government backed these contracts. So this PG Media lawsuit was a real culminating issue where, oh my gosh, people are really starting to sue and there's no clear process of how to sort these things out. There was also dissatisfaction over the monopoly with Network Solutions. So Network Solutions had a $70 per year monopoly on .com, .net, and .org. If you wanted a domain name The predominant domain name registrations were in there. CCTLDs were still pretty small. You had to go to NSI. People wanted to be in part of the game. Why is some U.S. government contractor, designated as a monopoly? Why can't other people get in this game? Increased global interest in internationalization and stakeholder input. Why should all these technical guys be running this? The internet is a big global thing, especially a bunch of technical guys predominantly in the US. The internet is a global thing. There's more at stake here than just the technology. There's commercial interest, so there was more interest in being involved. And finally, and this is really an important factor, is that traditional US government research agencies and their contractors like USC, ISI desperately wanted out. And they wanted out in part because of all of these lawsuits. These are research agencies, not commercial agencies. They would like to do research, please, rather than getting sued. And also, the National Science Foundation, the internet was becoming more commercial. The NSFNet had been decommissioned, right? They felt that their job was over, and nobody really wanted the legal liability. So even the U.S. government's own research agencies were saying, hey man, we're stepping out of this. I don't care what you want to do. Leave people with the monopoly. USC, ISI, John's a great guy, but we don't want the lawsuit. So they were interested in backing out. So we kind of had a perfect storm. One of the early solutions that came up to try and solve this, to try and address some of these issues that were going on, and to put a framework around for how the IANA functions would be operated going forward, was called the International Ad Hoc Committee. They also had a policy committee associated with called POC. So the IAHC was initiated predominantly by the technical community and John Pastel to figure out what the hell to do, right? So it was an attempt to solve the internationalization and competition problems also at the TLD and registry level. Competition seems like it can be a doable thing. Can we come up with a solution that's going to address this and also internationalize this process? The predominant members of the IHC MOU they tried to reach out was John. It was the Internet Society. It was the ITU. It was WIPO, which is the International Trademark Agency. It was the IAB. It was even the U.S. Federal Networking Council, trying to figure this out. And it was also INTA, which was the International Trademark Association. The problem is that especially with these international agencies, there was questions over where these agencies were getting these authorities to decide the internet anyway. In government circles, national governments like to generally keep a good eye on what their international agencies are doing since they run them and they fund them. And the question was, hey man, this doesn't seem to be part of your work plan. Why are you trying to sort of regulate or figure out what's going on the internet here without coordinating? And there was also a perceived lack of involvement with existing players, including NSI, and in general, and not enough consensus between stakeholders. So the IAHC MOU presented a lot of good ideas, which were eventually adopted. Still, this issue of participation, trying to broaden stakeholder participation, trying to address the competition issues. But ultimately, the IHC and the IHC MOU, it was called, was unable to come up with, overcome initial criticisms about the plan. It was basically too early. And at the time, the membership seemed reasonable, right? But it was still small and still kind of more reflected a technical and a research outlook rather than the future. At least that's what some people felt. So the U.S. government stepped in this kind of time of chaos. There's these lawsuits. Some U.S. government agencies want to leave. There's growing international pressure. Nobody wanted to see this system sort of devolve or go into chaos. So the U.S. government decided to step in to try and attempt to put things on a track of a stable evolution. And also the U.S. government sort of did have some authority that they could pull with these contracts. So a couple of the drivers were the following. Again, there was a domestic and international concern over the ad hoc nature of the original proposals, including the IAHC. There were other bodies and other organizations out there that were trying to fix this. and nobody could really figure out what was going on. So one of the reasons why the USG tried to come in was to try and open up a process of public comment that governments and other stakeholders could feel in some way was legitimate in terms of getting some of these concerns raised. One of the key, I have to say, tipping points that solidified the US government's decision to try and right the ship, to try and be a bit of an anchor here, was, I don't know if any of you remember John Pastel's root server experiment in January. Lehman is putting his hands over his ears. John Pastel's root zone experiment in 1998. Anybody remember this? John Pastel hijacking the internet? Technologists hijacking the internet? No? Okay. So very, very quickly, in the midst of all this, John kind of got, well, these are my words, okay? John kind of got a little bit irked that there was too much layer 8 and layer 9 going on here, too much law, too much financial stuff. You're getting in the way of a good proposal. And he, I wouldn't say directed, but let's say he suggested to the other root servers around the world, you know what? You're picking up your authoritative root zone from NSI right now. Why don't you just pick it up for me, the B root server, right? I'm John anyway, right? I make the list anyway. So all around the world, a number of root servers decided to change where they were picking up the authoritative zone file. They changed it from A, and they were starting to pick it up from John. This caused a lot of panic, because basically, how could one person, a technical researcher sitting in the United States, make a decision that could potentially impact the entire global internet, right? What the heck is going on here? Basically, it lasted a couple of weeks. It was cast as an experiment in trying to test the root server system and the flexibility. But this was a key moment, because it was a real proof point that there needed to be some kind of more sort of stable or acceptable arrangement. You know, we can't have one person flying the golden goose. So we need a system around it. The US government also wanted to try and attempt a non-regulatory solution. So first this came to the lap of the FCC, which is the regulator. The US government said, we don't want this to be regulated internationally. We don't want it to be regulated domestically by the US. So let's shift it to a policymaking agency, which is how it came to the Department of Commerce. And also one of the key issues was to introduce a technically stable introduction of registration competition. The US research agencies, as I mentioned, were unwilling to shoulder the legal risk. So somebody had to take it on. So that was transitioned to the Department of Commerce, because literally, you know, the National Science Foundation, USC, ISI, they were just ready to back up and say the contracts are done, the contracts are over. I'm sorry, we really don't care what happens. Our research function is done. So basically what happened is the USG, through the Department of Commerce, became the ultimate legal backstop during the transition. So a number of these, again, what were almost footnotes, especially in the Netnod contract, for the IANA function, was transitioned to the Department of Commerce. Key aspects of the cooperative agreement between the National Science Foundation and Network Solutions were transitioned to the Department of Commerce, so there could be some backstop while this transition was happening. And one of the reasons why this was done is because if you're going to sue, there's all of these lawsuits, it's better to sue the US government, because the US government has a lot of money to defend itself in a lawsuit. So it kind of makes suing people unattractive. That was one of the other benefits of having the US government being the legal authority during this transition. After a couple of policy statements and requests for input, the 1998 Statement of Policy came out. So I was involved in, just checking my time here. Oops, I got to finish up. The Statement of Policy came out, which basically said it's no longer for the US government to be involved, including for IANA. We need a global system. The US government signaled its intent to transition IANA and DNS functions to a stakeholder-driven global nonprofit organization. The US government took a lot of input for how this should be done from the technical community. So I know a lot of technical guys think, governance doesn't matter, or I don't know how to participate. The technical community was critical in trying to get the principles right instead of saying a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach driven by stakeholders and the community, as well as providing advice to how to deal with these technical issues to transitioning to a competitive environment in registries. So the technical community, individuals as well as the community at large, was instrumental in helping to try and get this right, given the other trajectories that it could have gone. And then NTIA was going to contract these IANA functions to the new organization, which became known as ICANN, until that organization was ready to take it on. One of the things here, also by the advice of the technical community, was to keep the IANA functions together, to keep the protocol parameters together, to keep the numbering functions together, and to keep the domain name functions together, in part because of John. So in the US government, we said, hey, we'd really like to get this done quickly. We think it can be done by September 30th, 2000. Well, it took about 15 years longer to actually get it underway. So this is what the IANA functions look like today and how they are performed. So you will see that basically the policy-making process for these comes from the bottom up and from the community. The protocol parameters policy is set through the IETF community. The oversight for that is by the IAB. And then IANA, which is located at ICANN under a contract with the US government at the moment, IANA implements the policy. Relatively straightforward, not much of a controversy. Numbers is the same way. The RIRs set the policy. The NRO, which is the numbering council, does the oversight. IANA does the implementation. There's a small role here for ICANN in policy, including about launching new RIRs, some things to do with rubber stamping, global policies that the RIRs develop. But for the most part, at the IANA level, it's a bookkeeping function. And the communities do the policy in the bottom-up way. The name side is a little bit different, because one of the reasons why ICANN was developed was to be the policy-making function for names. So policy-making happens through a stakeholder bottom-up way at ICANN, and the IANA function at ICANN records that. So as I mentioned, it took, transition isn't done, but it took 14 years longer to finally the US government announce that this transition is going to happen. The US government wants to step out of its contract role and no longer have it. So in March 14th, the Department of Commerce said, hey, we really want out. We're really serious. And then it asked ICANN, can you guys convene this process to convene global stakeholders to develop a proposal for how the IANA function should be maintained, how stewardship should be maintained when the US government ultimately steps away, when the US government is no longer that backstop of last resort. So that is a process that I know we've been talking about here at Netnod through the various meetings, and Nurani and Patrik are going to get an update on what's going on since then. Just one thing, the proposals that were, the principles for the transition that were issued by the Department of Commerce were really based on things that came ultimately from the technical community back in the 1990s. So again, another really great point of how it is so important to have technical input into policy making, because governments listen, not just the US government, but around the world, and I know in Sweden here as well. I won't go over this in detail, but one of the big friction points in this whole process with the IANA transition, as I mentioned, the policy making for protocols and numbers are pretty much separate from ICANN. But in ICANN, you have a confluence of the policy for names being established, and ICANN also doing the administration of the IANA functions. So you get this very close, you get this confluence where now when we're talking about the IANA transition, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about what people are trying to aim at in terms of making the IANA stewardship transition versus what people are trying to fix in the name development policy making process. So this is one of the areas for confusion. So just quickly in closing, what are some of the things that have changed since 1996? And some of these things have to do with scale, and this is really why these issues are still hard. Today, of course, almost everything is commercial, especially in the namespace. It's a very commercial space. Numbers and protocol parameters, a little bit less so, but internet in general, almost everything is commercial. A difference from the old NREN days, today even NRENs deal with non-research traffic, so even NRENs aren't just research networks themselves. They've got students that like to watch YouTube and Netflix and all that kind of stuff. And now in this environment, many of the old NRENs that used to do CCTLDs have spun it off to now more professional, or I don't want to say more professional, but to separate organizations responsible for CCTLD administration. In terms of internet users, there's about 3.2 internet users, and only 10% are in the US. This is one of the reasons why you have so much more international participation in places like ICANN than you ever had in 1996. Over 1 billion internet hosts today. And in terms of the domain name market, where there was about 500,000 domain names, today there's over 264 million domain names. If you average it out, it's about a direct market of $2.6 billion, not including the value-added services that many registrars offer. So despite all of this tumultuous process in putting together a competitive environment, it's really become a quite successful global market, and it's providing benefits all around the world, and entrepreneurial benefits all around the world. There's registrars everywhere registering domain names, and we have a competitive registration system globally. So with that, I will end. I guess really here my moral of the story is there was we use a phrase in the US, a tempest in a teapot back in 1996. The environment was still small, but you still saw all of those headlines. So it's no wonder here you see that when the market and when the size of the internet has grown, we still see this as we're trying to finish up the IANA transition process. And again, the participation by the technical community is absolutely key, and it's one of the great things that Netnod can be able to contribute constructively to helping us get us through this process. Thanks.
Great, really interesting talk. Thank you. I'll let you hang on to that microphone, actually. So we'll take, I'll give my quick update on what's happening in the number space, and then Patrik is going to talk about the overall process, and then I thought we could take questions at the end.
Want me to come down here?
I can take this one, so if you mute yours, it'll be fine. Thanks. Okay, that was a really nice introduction to this whole process, because it kind of sets the scene a bit. I think some of you might be aware of the IANA Stewardship transition, and some of you might not. But even those of you who are aware of it might not know the whole background. So I'm going to give a little bit of the perspective from the numbers community. We gave an update at the last meeting for those of you who were there. But I'm the vice chair of something called the CRISP team, and the CRISP team is the team that was put together to represent the views of the number community, and that's sort of the RIR community, the community that handles IP addresses and AS numbers and a few other things. So just very briefly, the RIR community of 5 different RIRs. They handle IP addresses, AS numbers, and some special purpose DNS zones. And like Karen was saying, in the very early days, we didn't have RIRs. Then we had John Pastel, basically, and then the RIPE NCC was the European registry that started up. Was the very first one. There was really a bunch of operators who got together and said, "Hey, we should have our own IP registry. We should handle this here." And then after that, a few others started up. So I was around then when you were talking about that, how the policy development was happening there at the end of the 90s. And I was with the RIPE NCC then, and seeing how this was all put in place. And the RIPE NCC as an RIR had didn't have very mature processes either at that time. This is something that's been sort of developed over the last 20 years or so. And after that, we saw, at that time, we were actually responsible for the IP allocation of the northern part of Africa. It was seen as logical that Europe sort of handled northern Africa, and southern Africa was handled by ARIN, the American registry. But Afrinic and LACNIC then managed to start up their own RIRs. So basically, just to set the scene a little bit, so the RIRs, they get their big block of IP addresses from IANA, from ICANN. As you may know, there are not that many IPv4 addresses left. So, but in the past, basically, what would happen would be, so I, at the time, would write a mail to IANA and say, hey, can we have another /8? We've run out. And they'd say, okay, here you go. And then we would start distributing that. And basically, the way the RIRs get addresses from the IANA is set by a global policy. And it's the RIR communities. It's not IANA or ICANN that sets or develops any of that policy. It gets passed to the ICANN board for ratification, but it's a completely separate policy process from ICANN. And we're talking about very few requests per year. This is a slide I don't particularly like because it's very big over here and very small over there, and it really should be the other way around because very little happens in this space. The ASO is sort of the representative body for these numbers, the number community in the ICANN space. But really, if you want to get IP addresses or AS numbers from, well, in this case, it's the RIPE NCC, that is distributed according to policies that you set. It's done in a truly bottom-up way. And if you're not happy with those policies, you can participate on the mailing list, or you can go to a meeting and say, hey, this sucks, we need to change this. And it happens all the time. And people kind of get surprised when you say that, because they kind of say, yeah, but there's no point, you know, going there and discussing with these people. But these policies change all the time. And that all happens sort of in these regional communities and not really anywhere else. And they vary as well from the various regions. The RIPE NCC policies are different from the LACNIC ones, and they're different from the APNIC ones, etc. So the only ones that are sort of for the old, that are sort of consistent for all the regions are really the global policy. So all the RIRs get addresses from IANA in the same way. Okay, so what's oversight? Well, oversight has, like Karen explained, has originally sat with the US government, and it really means that the NTIA has a contract with ICANN about providing these services to the RIRs. And they have really had a very hands-off role. They have not gone in and had opinions on certainly no policy or any implementation parts. It's really just been a contract to say, okay, you should be providing these addresses to the RIRs. So when this whole stewardship process started up, all the 5 RIRs said, okay, we need to have a team to represent the community and develop this. Discussions started in all 5 regions, and all the 5 regions actually started putting together some key principles or some key parts of a proposal. And for each region, they selected 3 people, 1 RIR staff member and then 2 community representatives. So I was selected as a community representative for this region, the RIPE region, so to speak. And then we were tasked with the not so pleasant task of basically taking all this input from all these mailing lists and all these meetings and all these principles that the various regions put together, and we had 2 months over Christmas and New Year's to do this, so that's what I did. That's why I'm taking a long holiday this Christmas. And put together a proposal, get public comments on it, etc., and then finally put it in. So that was the original timeline that was set. So as Karen mentioned, we're talking about 3 communities: the number community, the IETF for the protocol parameters, and then the names community. This timeline that you see here was sort of never actually happened that way, because the names community very early on identified that we've got a few different things to talk about. We need to talk about the operational stuff, what's going to happen if NTIA releases this contract. But the other thing was the accountability, because like I said, for both the protocol and the numbers community, they're quite separate in many ways from ICANN. And while in the names community, a lot of these things are mixed together. So for the names community, they said, well, if ICANN is going to fly solo, we want to make sure that it's an accountable organization. So the names community basically asked for more time, and they put in their proposal in June this year. And then this CCWG, which is this accountability group that was put together, are still discussing a few things, and we'll come to what that means for us. So what about the numbers proposal? Well, it was a very simple proposal. Basically, it says, okay, IANA needs to be stable and reliable. So that's, you know, we don't want to move we don't want to sort of rebuild the engine, the airplane in mid-flight. So let's keep what's working and change what needs to change. And instead of NTIA having contract with ICANN, the RIRs would have a service level agreement. And then there were a few little things like a review committee that should have community representation, and some issues with the IPRs that needed to be clarified as well. So these were sort of the priorities. And these are all really fine words, and it sounds really great, but I think as someone who has actually been active in the numbers community for 16 or so years, I can say that these are actually truly principles that these communities hold, and I think that's also why, while it was a cumbersome process in some ways, it was also a very simple process to put together this proposal for the numbers community. So if you look, actually I'll do the next one, I think that one's a little bit clearer. So if you look at the top, basically the NTIA has a service agreement with ICANN, and it's the IANA that gives out, see those little IP addresses and AS numbers to the RIRs. And the number community are the ones who sets the policy process. How should IP addresses and AS numbers be handed out? How should this be managed, according to what rules, etc. And instead of having the NTIA have this agreement with ICANN, we said, okay, well, it makes sense for the RIRs to have a service level agreement with ICANN. In that sense, it's very simple. So there are a few things happening now. Basically, the coordinating body that Patrik will talk about, they have consolidated all these community proposals and put it out as one. We are currently also resolving some of these IPR issues, basically the trademark IANA and the IANA domain name. There have been some reviews of this contract, this SLA that the RIRs will have with ICANN, and there have been community feedback on that. And there's also already a draft charter published for this community-based review committee. So where are we now? Well, all the 3 proposals are in. This coordination group has taken all these proposals and produced a combined proposal. There are a few issues that we need to still coordinate between the 3 communities, but there are no real showstoppers there. The ICG, Patrik and his colleagues have come back to us and said, can you clarify these things? How is this going to work? How will you implement this, etc. But there's still one part that hasn't finished, and that's this accountability work. And it's really not accountability for the numbers community or the RIRs, but it's accountability of ICANN. So at the moment, we are waiting for this group to finalize its work so that we all can move forward with the transition. we are ready, and we have started implementing the things that we need to implement. And we basically just want someone to say go and start the actual practical implementation of shifting these responsibilities. And this is where Patrik will give me all the answers of how this will be solved.
Thank you, Nurani. Thank you. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, cool. So, yeah. So, given this background from Karen on what IANA is doing, and then Nurani explained what the basically where we are, let me try to just wrap up relatively quickly. So, I am together with Lars-Johan Lehmann and many others as representatives from various organizations sitting on the ICG, which was the group that was tasked to originally sort of come up with a complete proposal to hand over to NTIA. In that group, I was tasked to be one of 3 chairs. So we are trying to, so I got this sort of nice job of working harder during the summer while Nurani was working during the Christmas. So here's an update. This is the first time we use these slides. They will actually, first time they will be used in Dublin on Saturday. Anyways, so NTIA announced in March. We were formed in July. We issued an RFP in September, so we worked during last summer. And then we sort of were sitting there waiting for the responses, like Nurani explained it. The numbers responded in January like we wanted. IETF responded in January like we wanted, but names did not respond until summer of 2015. We already started to do our evaluation and went one round of questions, but in reality we got all the proposals in July. Between July and now, what we have done is that we created a combined proposal and sent that on public comments. We got 157 comments back, and it was from organizations, it was from individuals, from people that were sort of recognized from the old days that Karen described from 1998. Those people still exist, that basically they can be classified as sort of a sibling organization to Flat Earth Society and such. But of course there are lots of serious comments as well. We got comments in English, Chinese, Spanish and French, which also required translation of these and all of that sort of, there was also a lot of bookkeeping and paperwork to make sure that everything is working correctly. We got quite a good diverse responses on this open consultation. And one of the responsibilities for us in ICG is not so much to sort of look at the proposals, those who are created by, for example, the CRISP team. What we are responsible is to ensure that both what is suggested is a bottom-up process according to the criteria by NTIA, that, by the way, Internet Society wrote a very good paper at that we in ICG think was really, really good. It has helped us. But also our process must be run the same way. The process itself in the CRISP team and what we're doing in ICG also must be a multi-stakeholder bottom-up process. So we are also evaluating whether we believe that the CRISP team has been running a proper process. So regarding the support of the proposal, we have 61% that were in supporting it, 27 were opposing, and then 12% that we could categorize as neither support nor oppose. Some of the opposing comments, they were primarily coming from individuals, but there were also other exceptions, and some comments could be interpreted as sort of both support and of course oppose. Specifically from some governments that were kind of interesting, including the Swedish government. So of course people ask me what I have done lately. So the comments that we got was mainly on the dependency of the CCWG that Nurani mentioned, why they were late. It was sort of sad. Many people thought that we were depending on them. Some others, of course, felt that we could not do anything at all unless the accountability work was done. A lot of comments regarding the relationship between, for example, the OIRs and the new IANA called PTI. It was also comments regarding the board and whether you could sort of appeal the decisions by the new IANA. There were some questions regarding the root zone maintainer system that, of course, is addressed in some other things. The jurisdiction of ICANN, there are some comments, of course, that don't think it's right to have ICANN under the US jurisdiction. And there were some references to CCTLDs, also sort of a continuation of the discussions that Karen described earlier regarding CCTLD delegation and redelegation. How do you make a decision on who is responsible for the TLD for a CCTLD? But it was basically sort of, we sort of expected comments regarding those things, so it was kind of okay. Regarding support, people felt that there were a lot of support to enhance the multi-stakeholder model that also was a criteria by NTIA. We believe in ICG that those criteria was met, both in the process that we are running and also in the proposed solutions. There are some root zone maintenance-related requirements that still has to be ironed out, but we believe those can be handled in the implementation phase, but still important to take care of. And then the question, of course, is what will happen in Dublin. So we in ICG, we will have meetings Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, Monday, Thursday, and then Friday, end of the meeting. And at that point in time, we think we will be done. It's even the case that we are looking at maybe not even having to meet on the Friday. But of course, that means done, so we can sort of hibernate until the CCWG proposal is ready. They have a lot of work to do next week. When they are done, then, as you saw in some of the arrows of Nurani's pictures, we have to take the CCWG proposal, go back to the names community and ask, will this resolve the dependencies between what you have written and the accountability? And if they respond yes, then we are done, and then we can send our proposal to NTA. But until they are done, I will probably spend time on my day job issues and not so much on this, which I look forward to. So that was all from me to talk about the end game. So for the actual operational thing, I think and hope that we have the end game next week, which I think is great. We who have been working on this since '98. So with that, I think I ask Nurani and Karen to also come to the stage, and we're prepared to answer questions if you have any.
We have about 7 minutes, so feel free to ask any questions you have.
Well, the big question I think some people have is, will this impact my operation? And I think that's a question to Nurani, specifically for numbers. Maybe you can... Will it have any impact on their operation?
Well, hopefully not. I mean, it depends what the question is. If we move forward with the transition, no. Then it won't. Then the RARs will be getting, their resource numbers, number of resources as usual, and they'll be able to continue to provide them.
Yeah, so let me be a little bit more specific. So what you're saying is that the policy development process within the RIRs will continue exactly like they were before, and what we're talking about is just the interaction between the RIRs and IANA, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So Karen, I'm asking the questions now, like we have to sort of wait a bit. Do you think what we're now doing, is this exactly what you were expecting in 2000?
No. No.
Oh, damn.
Look, I think back then, even looking in 2000, well, in 1998, we thought, oh, this is easy. Finish it by 2000. U.S. government wants to be out, handle it in a couple of years. But I think one of the things that's been the change is exponentially the space has grown. And I think the commercial dimension of the DNS space and how quickly that has grown into its own industry also added an additional layer of complexity. So we're dealing now with a much more complicated space, and there's many, many more stakeholders interested, especially in '96. I mean, we couldn't fill half this room with the people that were interested in this stuff, quite frankly. And now, you go to like an ICANN meeting or someplace at the IGF, and there's thousands of people that want to actively participate. So it's very different. The other thing that's different as well, I have to say, is quite frankly, how easy the protocol parameters and the addressing space was. In the beginning, when ICANN was being created, the thought was, well, you know, names, numbers, and protocol parameters would be of equal kind of interest and have an equal almost role within ICANN. But very, very quickly, you saw how the names space really dominated the conversations, and the protocol parameters and numbering space, you know, with the community processes that were already in place, clicked along pretty fine. So I think there was a big change in the nature and the difference of the 3 IANA functions, which raises some questions as to should they still be together, and how different the namespace and how much interest there was across many, many more stakeholders. So it's different and it's more challenging now than I think we expected.
Can I comment on that? Being someone who's been active in the numbers community, I think, you know, the reason it was fairly simple to put together a proposal for the numbers community, there are 2 things. One is it's not a particularly glamorous space. No one really, you know, they're not that many, you know, there's not that much big money and not that many governments who are that interested in IP addressing. And we're quite happy about that. But the second part is actually, if we're going to be a bit more serious about things, you know, whenever I speak to other people who are sort of involved in this transition, they say, yeah, but your job was easy. And I say, yeah, but it was easy because we've actually consciously spent 20 or so years building these processes. And something that, you know, I found interesting was that I did not receive one single question from anyone in the broader community about should the RIRs really hold this contract? Are they accountable? Are they competent? Are they in touch with their community? Are there, you know, community-driven processes? Because I think those things have been made very clear over the last 10, 20 plus years.
And I also happen to be chair of the Security and Stability Advisory Committee of ICANN, which is one of the organizations that is to approve the CCWG proposal. And one thing that we have pointed out all the time is what Karen pointed out and what you just pointed out, Nurani, and that is that in ICANN, even though the names process was created long after the RIRs, it was still created without looking at what the RIRs have done successfully. So, for example, if you look at the IETF or look at the RIRs, if you look at the best example is probably any kind of RFC. Those of you who have looked at an RFC, there's a specific section calling the IANA consideration section. And those are direct instructions to IANA that the policy development process of the IETF has developed. So it is the PDP that creates the instructions to IANA. In the name side, the policy development process, they are developing some kind of sort of overarching policy statements that is then giving over to ICANN staff and board to rewrite that into instructions to IANA. They send it out on public comment, yada, yada, yada. And at the end of the day, ICANN staff is sort of writing the instructions to IANA, which is not what the PDP has created. So there's no real separation between the PDP, what ICANN staff, and what instructions to IANA is, which is a clear separation in the 2 other communities. On top of that, they are conflated by having the same organization running the policy development process and the IANA itself. So it's sort of doomed to fail already from the beginning. And honestly, even though I personally have been part of this, I don't understand sort of it ended up being like this. So from ESSAC, we have pointed this out over and over again, that the policy development process in ICANN and the namespace must be improved because the lack of clarity there, which is sort of what both of you pointed out, is, we think from ESSAC, one of the reasons why people are looking so carefully at the accountability of ICANN. Because simply, to be fair, ICANN board is today making decisions that neither the board of an RIR or the sort of the board equivalent of the IETF should even get close to, because it's the community that should make those decisions and not the board. And this is, from my perspective, from ESSAC perspective, one of the reasons why the accountability questions on ICANN and ICANN board is so large.
And it comes back to this whole question about will this affect the operators? Well, hopefully not, but because you know, if you have a functioning process, then things will continue to run smoothly. But you know, if all of a sudden you have someone else come in and say, no, we're going to change this policy, and no, you won't get those resources, but you will, then it will affect the operators. So, I mean, so in the numbers space, that being sort of mature and kind of stable is of the essence in this process. What will change in the names community is a bit more complex.
And with that, I think we run out of time, right? So I hand over to you again, Nurani. You know the program much more better than I.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.